I want to talk a little bit about the relationship of trust between the two of you. You only had worked together once on a story that was not at all as involved as this one. But you had, there was this incredible trust from the beginning. So how did that develop? How do you cultivate it?
Well, I think it's on one hand very simple, on the other hand, like all relationships, complicated. Nadja and I and the photo editor of California Sunday, I think spoke on average once every 2 weeks, once every 10 days to discuss the logistics of the piece, or the logistics of the journey. And so just out of those conversations, it was unspoken, we began to have a level of trust. Nadja understood we did not want her to take unnecessary risks. There obviously was a huge risk in the piece itself. And so all of those conversations, I think, built up a level of trust. It was also when Nadja returned, we had a series of conversations about the piece and the nature of the piece. And at some point before she began writing, she sent me a memo, which I just looked at again this morning, about the kind of theme of the story, what the story was about, what her characters were, and what her outline was. And we had another long conversation about all of that. And then, Nadja and I have discussed this before, which was on one hand, the editing process was not ideal for a lot of reasons. We were under a ferocious deadline. And it meant that, and I hate doing this, Nadja was sending me chunks of the piece and that I would be editing while she was writing the next chunks of the piece. And as any editor on this Zoom call, I suspect, feels the same way. You want to see the whole thing before you plunge in and edit. And so editing it piecemeal is a difficult process. But even in editing piecemeal, we had a number of phone calls. And then we did something which I believe is really important. Other people think it's completely nutty and crazy. But when we were all, I had sent back, Nadja had done her revisions, I had sent back edits of the revision, and we were now down to the last 5 or 6 or 7% of the piece of things we had to look at. We then got on the telephone, and which I really do believe is important at the last stage, because I think email is terrible for conversation. And we then began at the top of the piece, and we would read it quietly. Sometimes we would read it out loud. There would be a note from Nadja having a question about something. There'd be a note I would have, and we would discuss it through. And and please, people, don't be so horrified by this. We spent an entire day. We spent 9 hours from something like 9 o'clock in the morning till, it was midnight, I think, or something, Nadja's time, going over line by line, word by word for the piece. And you develop an enormous amount of trust, and you have a real sense of each other by the end of it. But we had talked enormously up to that point. And I want to say, we took breaks during that 9 hours, but we were—
Let me eat and drink my coffee.
Nadja let me make a coffee run as well. But it's out of those deep conversations that you get to know someone and understand what their concerns are, where, it wasn't as if we agreed on everything, but we knew, and I think this is really crucial, we knew how to disagree. And that was enormously valuable.
And there was one important piece of disagreement, right? The coda, or the ending of the story. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Nadja?
Sure. So our original vision for the piece was that I would be focusing on the characters' journeys through the Darien Gap, but that I would also include what was happening to them in another country of their journey. And from the beginning, we didn't know which country that was going to be, and we decided that would be determined through the course of reporting. And so it ended up making a lot of sense for me to catch up with specifically the Cameroonian group in southern Mexico when they unexpectedly really got stuck and were not able to leave southern Mexico for the US border. And the couple weeks that I spent with them there were far more dramatic than I had imagined. It was really kind of action-packed. I was able to observe so much directly. And so the original vision was that I was going to have, a pretty substantial part of the piece be based in Mexico. We were even thinking about ending the piece in the United States when certain people had crossed over. And this reporting process was long enough that, I was tracking migrants as they moved through these different countries. And then once they kind of went into there was a point where all of them just went dark and they, went into the black hole of either Mexican immigration detention or ICE facilities in the US. In any case, the disagreement that Kit and I had was that, there was so little time in the end. We were up against this deadline. My drafts were just enormously long. Kit had to do this, really Herculean job of not only cutting, but reshaping. And so what it meant was that I didn't have time to start writing the Mexico section. Kit at one point said to me, he's like, we're going to edit it and I want you to do the revisions of what we have so far. And then we're going to write Mexico as a coda, basically. And so that's what we did. And the coda it never made it into the final piece. And Kit can explain, what he thought of the coda and other editors at California Sunday magazine. But for me, it was a crushing moment because I felt like it was so important to their journeys. And I felt that there was just really dramatic material there. So I know we all have to kill our darlings, but this was a really big darling to kill. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking on this?
Yeah, so it was really clear in terms of both the length of what Nadja was writing and our timing that we weren't going to be able to, in the piece on the southern Mexican border or the northern Mexican border or in the US. And so I thought a postscript / coda might be the solution. And then, I read the end of the essence, the Darien Gap part of the piece, which was when they were in the Panamanian migrant camps, and several of the Cameroonians are getting on a bus to leave for the northern Panamanian border. And I thought it was the perfect ending. And it's the ending that's in the piece. And, they're hopeful, they're optimistic. And I knew that California Sunday readers, I knew that almost any reader would know that there was a huge gap between their hope and optimism and what they were about to face. And that this was a classic example of what was unspoken and unsaid would be much more powerful than what was explicit and said. And I was absolutely convinced that this was true. I am still convinced that this is true. But I also wanted to, honor and recognize that Nadja felt differently, and that she had, made this huge commitment, investment in this piece, and took extraordinary courage. What she did, that cannot be understated in any way. And so I asked her to write the coda, and then presented it to the executive editor and the editor-in-chief of California Sunday, and said, could you take a look at this? And I was very careful not to convey my view about this or Nadja's view. I said, can you take a look at this in the context of everything you've now read? And they both came back saying, no, the original ending is stronger. The coda is interesting, but actually takes away from the hyper concentration of this piece being about the Darien Gap. I had to call Nadja and say, we all felt strongly that it was a much stronger piece without. And I know Nadja didn't agree, but trusted me at that point. And I actually don't know to this day whether Nadja at this point still agrees or disagrees, but that's where we were. So
can you reveal that, Nadja? And then we'll ask a couple of questions from the chat.
Yeah, no, I think that in terms of what the story became, for being a story about the Darien Gap, it was appropriate that it ended there.